Operation Mincemeat. You're staring at a corpse floating face down in Spanish waters. April 30th, 1943. The body wears a Royal Marines uniform. A briefcase is chained to his wrist. Inside that case are invasion plans. Plans that will decide the fate of Europe. The dead man's name is Major William Martin. He doesn't exist. The body washes ashore at Huelva. Spanish authorities recover the briefcase. German intelligence officers photograph every document inside. The papers reveal Allied plans to invade Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. Within weeks, German High Command redeploys entire divisions. The 12th Army moves from Sicily to Greece. Panzer reserves shift north. When Allied forces storm the beaches of Sicily on July 9th, they face a fraction of the expected resistance. Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montagu of British Naval Intelligence conceived the operation. Working with Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of the Royal Air Force, Montagu obtained the body of Glyndwr Michael, a homeless man who died from rat poison in London. They transformed him into Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. The coroner's office provided the corpse. The 20 Committee, Britain's double agent system, crafted the false identity. Personal letters from a fictional fiancée named Pam filled his pockets. Theater ticket stubs. A stern letter from his bank about an overdraft. Every detail calculated to convince German intelligence this was a real officer carrying real secrets. The operation succeeded beyond all projections. German forces defending Sicily numbered 40,000 instead of the anticipated 300,000. Allied casualties dropped by an estimated 75%. The invasion proceeded 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Operation Husky became the template for D-Day planning. The deception may have shortened the war by months. Here's what makes this impossible to understand. Operation Mincemeat disappeared from official histories for 3 decades. The British government classified all documents related to the operation until 1977. American military histories published immediately after the war made no mention of the deception. The official history of British intelligence in the Second World War, published in 1979 by Professor Harry Hinsley of Cambridge University, devoted exactly 3 paragraphs to an operation that redirected the entire German war machine. The mainstream explanation centers on wartime security protocols. Intelligence operations remain classified to protect methods and sources still active during the Cold War. The 20 Committee's double agent network continued operating against Soviet targets through the 1950s. Revealing deception techniques would compromise future operations. Standard intelligence practice demanded operational security extend decades beyond the actual mission. But the evidence suggests something deeper than routine classification. Montagu's own memoir, The Man Who Never Was, published in 1953, was heavily censored by British intelligence. Entire chapters were removed. Key details about German response patterns were deleted. Most significantly, all references to Ultra intercepts were eliminated. Ultra was Britain's code-breaking operation that provided real-time confirmation of German troop movements. Ultra proved Operation Mincemeat worked. Yet Ultra's role in validating the deception vanished from all accounts. Some researchers suggest the classification served to hide how completely British intelligence had penetrated German command structures. Documents released in 1996 revealed that British agents had direct access to German high command discussions about the false invasion plans. The level of penetration was unprecedented. Professor David Kahn's analysis in The Reader of Gentleman's Mail indicates British intelligence was reading German communications in real time, allowing them to track exactly how the deception spread through Nazi command structures. The operation's success created an uncomfortable truth. A single corpse carrying false documents redirected an entire army. No complex technology, no massive resources. Just one dead homeless man transformed into a fictional officer. The implications challenged fundamental assumptions about military intelligence and strategic deception. If one operation could achieve such results, what other deceptions might be possible? What other operations might have been hidden? Why classify an operation that demonstrated British intelligence superiority for 34 years? What other details about German penetration remain hidden today? If Ultra confirmed the deception worked in real time, what other Ultra intercepts shaped the war's outcome? How many other fictional officers carried false plans across enemy lines? The archives in Warsaw hold evidence of another kind of deception, entirely one where the truth was buried not to protect methods, but to protect the living from what the dead had witnessed. The Warsaw Ghetto Archive. You smell the rotting wood of the tenement floor beneath your knees. Your hands shake as you lower the milk can into the hole you've carved beneath the basement steps. Inside, 25,000 documents. Birth certificates, death records, Nazi deportation orders, children's drawings of skeletal figures, eyewitness accounts of mass executions typed on stolen German paper. It's August 19th, 1942. You are Emanuel Ringelblum, historian turned archivist of the apocalypse. Around you, members of your secret Oneg Shabbat group seal tin boxes with melted wax. You're bearing the most comprehensive documentation of genocide ever assembled. What you don't know is that Allied intelligence will spend the next 3 years systematically ignoring almost everything you've preserved. Ringelblum established the Oneg Shabbat archive in October 1940, just months after the Germans sealed the Warsaw Ghetto. His team included 61 writers, teachers, economists, and ordinary citizens who understood they were witnessing systematic extermination. They collected everything: German administrative orders, Jewish council meeting minutes, personal diaries, underground newspapers, economic data showing deliberate starvation policies, and detailed maps of deportation routes to Treblinka. The archive operated in complete secrecy for 3 years. Members used code names. Documents were copied by hand onto thin paper that could be buried in small containers. Ringelblum, trained at the University of Warsaw under historians Marceli Handelsman and Ignacy Scheiper, applied rigorous academic methodology to documenting horror in real time. Every document was verified by multiple sources. Every testimony was corroborated. Between July and September 1942, Ringelblum's team documented the deportation of 265,000 Jews from the ghetto to Treblinka. They recorded the exact train schedules, the number of cattle cars, the German units involved. They interviewed survivors who escaped from the death camp and returned to warn others. By November, they had compiled irrefutable evidence that Treblinka was a killing facility, not a resettlement camp. Here's what makes their story impossible to reconcile with official wartime history. Allied intelligence received detailed reports about the archive's findings throughout 1942 and 1943, but classified them as unverified or exaggerated. The Polish government in exile transmitted Ringelblum's documentation to London and Washington. The World Jewish Congress shared translated excerpts with State Department officials. The archive's evidence reached the highest levels of Allied command. The mainstream explanation is that Allied leaders doubted the reports because systematic genocide seemed too extreme to believe, and they lacked the military resources to intervene effectively in occupied Poland. Intelligence analysts, trained to be skeptical of wartime propaganda, applied standard verification protocols to unprecedented crimes. But the documentary evidence reveals a different pattern. State Department cables from 1942 show officials discussing the political complications of acknowledging genocide while maintaining alliances with countries that had their own Jewish populations. British intelligence reports classify Ringelblum's documentation as potentially inflammatory to civilian morale. Military planners argued that publicizing death camp evidence would divert resources from strategic bombing campaigns. The archive team made 3 separate attempts to get their documentation to Allied forces. In December 1942, they smuggled copies through the Polish underground to the Warsaw Uprising leadership, who transmitted them to London. In March 1943, Jewish resistance fighters carried additional documents during their escape from the ghetto. In July 1943, just weeks before the final deportations, Ringelblum himself attempted to reach Soviet forces advancing from the east. Soviet troops found the first cache of buried documents in September 1946. Polish researchers located the second cache in December 1950. The third cache, containing Ringelblum's personal diary and the most damaging evidence of Allied knowledge, remains missing. Some historians suggest it was deliberately removed during the immediate post-war period. Dr. Joseph Kermish of the Jewish Historical Institute published the first scholarly analysis of the archive contents in 1968, nearly 25 years after the documents were buried. His research revealed that Allied intelligence possessed detailed knowledge of German extermination policies 18 months before liberation forces reached the major death camps. The archive contained German administrative documents showing the systematic nature of genocide, contradicting post-war claims that the full scope of the Holocaust was unknown until 1945. What does it mean when the most comprehensive documentation of genocide is ignored by those with the power to act? How many other buried archives contain evidence that contradicts official timelines? If Ringelblum's meticulous documentation reached Allied command, what prevented action? Who decided that some historical evidence was too dangerous to acknowledge? What other wartime atrocities were documented in real time, then quietly classified for decades? The pattern of documented evidence being systematically overlooked extends far beyond European battlefields, reaching into the darkest corners of wartime medical experimentation. Unit 731 Biological Warfare Program. You're standing in a pristine laboratory in Pingfang, Manchuria. It's August 1945. The floors gleam white under fluorescent lights. Glass beakers catch the morning sun streaming through tall windows. Everything appears normal, medical, scientific. Then you notice the steel restraints bolted to the examination tables. The drain in the floor, stained dark despite repeated scrubbing, the smell of disinfectant failing to mask something else entirely. Behind reinforced doors, human subjects await what the researchers euphemistically call logs, because that's what people become here. Raw material for testing. This was the epicenter of Imperial Japan's biological warfare program, officially designated Unit 731. From 1937 to 1945, under the direction of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, Japanese scientists conducted systematic human experimentation on an industrial scale. The facility housed over 3,000 researchers across 6 square kilometers of laboratories, breeding grounds for pathogens, and prison blocks. Conservative estimates place the number of direct victims at over 3,000 individuals, primarily Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners, and Korean laborers. But the program's reach extended far beyond the laboratory walls. The documented scope of Unit 731's activities reads like a catalog of medical horrors. Researchers performed vivisections without anesthesia to observe the progression of diseases in living subjects. They exposed prisoners to anthrax, plague, cholera, and other biological agents to test transmission vectors and mortality rates. They subjected victims to extreme temperatures, pressure changes, and surgical procedures designed to understand human physical limits. Dr. Naito Ryochi, head of the unit's pathology division, maintained meticulous records of each experiment, cataloging symptoms, progression timelines, and mortality data with scientific precision. The program's external operations proved even more devastating. Between 1940 and 1942, Unit 731 deployed biological weapons against 11 Chinese cities. They contaminated water supplies with typhoid and cholera. They released plague-infected fleas from aircraft over populated areas. They distributed typhoid-laced chocolate to children. The resulting epidemics killed an estimated 400,000 Chinese civilians, according to records maintained by the Chinese government and corroborated by Japanese military documents discovered after the war. When Soviet forces approached Manchuria in August 1945, Ishii ordered the destruction of all evidence. Prisoners were executed, buildings were demolished, research materials were incinerated. The remaining staff prepared for evacuation to Japan, carrying with them 8 years of data on biological warfare effectiveness and human medical limits. The mainstream explanation for what happened next focuses on Cold War pragmatism. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Allied occupation of Japan, faced the emergence of Soviet influence in Asia. According to declassified documents from the National Archives, MacArthur's staff recognized the strategic value of Unit 731's research data for future biological warfare defense. In 1947, the United States granted immunity from war crimes prosecution to Ishii and his senior staff in exchange for exclusive access to their experimental results. This decision aligned with broader American Cold War strategy of prioritizing anti-Soviet intelligence over war crimes accountability. But the immunity agreement required systematic suppression of evidence that contradicted American moral authority in the Pacific. Files from the National Security Archive, declassified under the Freedom of Information Act in 1999, reveal the extent of this cover-up. American officials confiscated over 10,000 pages of experimental data, including detailed photographs and film footage of human experiments. They relocated key researchers to American biological warfare facilities at Fort Detrick, Maryland. They pressured Allied governments to exclude Unit 731 activities from the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Most significantly, they maintained this silence for over 40 years. While Nazi medical experiments became central to Nuremberg trial proceedings and Holocaust education, Unit 731 remained absent from official World War II histories. American textbooks mentioned Japanese atrocities in general terms, but avoided specifics about biological warfare. Japanese textbooks, with American approval during the occupation, described the unit as a water purification unit engaged in defensive medical research. The numbers reveal the scope of this historical erasure. Between 1945 and 1990, fewer than 12 academic papers in English language journals addressed Unit 731 activities in detail. By comparison, over 3,000 papers examined Nazi medical experiments during the same period. When journalist John Powell published the first comprehensive English language account in 1981, the Pentagon attempted to classify his research materials retroactively. How does an 8-year program that killed over 400,000 people disappear from official history? Why did American educators teach Nazi medical experiments while ignoring identical Japanese research? What classified biological warfare capabilities did the United States develop using data obtained from human experimentation? When did moral accountability become negotiable for strategic advantage? The silence surrounding Unit 731 established a pattern of historical selectivity that would shape how other wartime atrocities were remembered or forgotten. Katyn Forest massacre. You smell the damp earth and pine needles as you walk through the forest near Smolensk in April 1990. The Soviet officials beside you are unusually quiet. They've brought you here to witness something that will rewrite 50 years of accepted history. Your boots crunch on fallen branches as you approach a series of excavation sites. The forensic teams have been working for weeks, and what they found changes everything the world believed about wartime atrocities. The mass graves contain the remains of over 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and prisoners of war. Each skull shows the telltale entry wound of a single bullet to the back of the head. Dr. Krzysztof Szwagryk, chief of the Polish Institute of National Remembrance's Office for the Search and Identification of Victims, would later spend decades cataloging the evidence. His forensic reports, published in the Archives of Forensic Medicine and Criminology in 1995, documented the systematic execution methods. Soviet NKVD documents declassified by President Boris Yeltsin in 1992 revealed the signatures of Stalin, Beria, and other Politburo members on execution orders dated March 5, 1940. The paper trail was methodical. Internal memos from Lavrenti Beria to Stalin detailed the liquidation of captured Polish army officers, police, and intellectuals held in camps at Kozielsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. The executions took place between April and May 1940 in locations across Western Russia, with Katyn Forest serving as just one of several killing sites. For 50 years, the official story placed responsibility squarely on German forces. The Soviet Union had successfully convinced the Allied powers that Nazi troops discovered and executed the Polish prisoners during their 1941 advance into Soviet territory. This version became accepted fact, repeated in history, textbooks, and diplomatic communications throughout the Cold War. The mainstream explanation for the cover-up centers on wartime propaganda necessities. Stalin needed to maintain the alliance with Britain and the United States, who were supporting the Polish government in exile. Admitting to the massacre would have fractured the anti-Nazi coalition at a critical moment in the war. Soviet officials argued they had no choice but to deflect blame to preserve the united front against Hitler. But the forensic evidence tells a different story. The bodies were wearing uniforms and personal effects that placed their deaths in spring 1940, a full year before German forces reached the area. The bullet casings found at the sites were of Soviet manufacture. Most damning, the paper documents found on the victims had survived the damp conditions remarkably well, showing dates that predated the German invasion by over a year. Some researchers suggest the Katyn cover-up represents something far more significant than wartime expediency. The massacre eliminated Poland's intellectual and military leadership in a single coordinated operation. Professor Norman Davies of Oxford University, in his book Rising 44, published in 2003, argues that Katyn was part of a calculated strategy to ensure Poland could never again function as an independent state. The scope of the deception required coordination across multiple governments. British and American intelligence agencies possessed evidence contradicting the official Soviet narrative as early as 1943, yet maintained public silence. Classified British Foreign Office documents, released under the 30-year rule in 1973, show Winston Churchill personally decided to suppress information that would implicate the Soviets. How does an entire military leadership disappear while their allies control the narrative for half a century? What other wartime massacres remain buried under layers of diplomatic convenience? Why did it take the collapse of the Soviet Union to release documents that multiple governments possessed for decades? When strategic alliances require the sacrifice of truth, how many other inconvenient facts get quietly filed away? The pattern of institutional silence that protected the Katyn lie would soon extend to an even more sensitive operation involving Nazi scientists and American national security. Operation Paperclip. You can smell the charred ruins of Berlin through the train window as your convoy rolls past the bombed-out Reichsbank building on May 23, 1945. The war ended 2 weeks ago, but you're not here for victory parades. You're here for something else entirely. Your orders are classified above top secret, signed by President Truman himself just 5 days earlier. In your briefcase are new identities, new birth certificates, new histories for men whose rockets killed thousands of civilians in London, men whose experiments used slave labor, men who should be heading to Nuremberg with the other war criminals. Instead, you're about to make them Americans. What became known as Operation Paperclip began officially on August 20th, 1945. When the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency received authorization to recruit German scientists for American military programs. The operation's original name was Operation Overcast, changed to Paperclip after a security breach. Dr. Wernher von Braun, former SS Sturmbannführer and designer of the WW2 rocket that terrorized London, was among the first recruited. Between 1945 and 1959, over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States under the program. The documentation is extensive. The National Archives hold thousands of pages of Operation Paperclip files, many declassified only in the 1990s. Dr. Annie Jacobson's 2014 book, Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America, details how the program violated direct orders from President Truman, who had specifically prohibited the recruitment of any Nazi Party members or war criminals. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency simply falsified the scientists' backgrounds, removing evidence of Nazi Party membership and war crimes from their files. Von Braun's case illustrates the scope of this deception. His rockets were built using slave labor from the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp, where an estimated 20,000 prisoners died in conditions so horrific that more people died building the V2 than were killed by it. Yet by 1950, von Braun was working openly at the Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, developing rockets for NASA's predecessor organization. His team would eventually put Americans on the moon. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Operation Paperclip was a necessary Cold War measure. With the Soviet Union also recruiting German scientists, America needed their expertise to maintain technological superiority. The scientists' past affiliations, while regrettable, were secondary to national security interests. Their contributions to the American space program and missile defense systems justified the moral compromises. But the scope of the cover-up suggests something far more systematic than opportunistic recruitment. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency didn't just hide Nazi affiliations, they created entirely new biographical histories. Dr. Kurt Blom, who conducted biological warfare experiments on concentration camp prisoners, had his background completely sanitized. Dr. Hubertus Strughold, who performed high-altitude experiments that killed prisoners at Dachau, became the father of space medicine at the School of Aviation Medicine in Texas. The agency wasn't just recruiting scientists, it was erasing war crimes. Some researchers suggest Operation Paperclip represented a fundamental shift in American moral calculus, prioritizing technological advancement over justice. The timing is significant. While Nazi defendants were being tried at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity, their colleagues were being given American citizenship and defense contracts. This wasn't merely pragmatic recruitment, it was active participation in covering up war crimes. The program's influence extended far beyond the space race. Paperclip scientists worked on chemical weapons programs, medical research, and nuclear technology. Many remained classified for decades. Their work hidden not just from the public, but from other government agencies. The Central Intelligence Agency's own documents, released through Freedom of Information Act requests, show they were often unaware of what the Defense Department was doing with former Nazi personnel. Here's what makes Operation Paperclip impossible to reconcile with official narratives. If these men were truly reformed scientists, whose expertise outweighed their past, why the elaborate cover-ups? Why create false identities instead of public rehabilitation programs? Why hide their work for 50 years if it served legitimate national security interests? The secrecy suggests the program's architects knew they were violating not just Truman's direct orders, but fundamental principles of post-war justice. How do you build a space program on war crimes and call it progress? Why were Nazi scientists deemed more valuable than their victims' justice? What other wartime accommodations remain hidden in classified files? Who decided that American technological supremacy justified erasing the Holocaust from personnel files? While America was secretly rehabilitating war criminals, it was simultaneously allowing other wartime decisions to claim millions of lives through deliberate inaction. The Bengal famine. You can smell the death from 3 blocks away. It's October 1943, and you're walking through the Sealdah station in Calcutta. Bodies line the platform. Children with distended bellies reach toward passing British officers who step carefully around them. The monsoon has ended, but no grain trains have arrived. They've been redirected west, toward the Middle East, where Allied forces are building strategic reserves. 3 million people are dying while Churchill's war cabinet debates shipping priorities over tea and biscuits in Whitehall. The Bengal famine of 1943 remains one of the most systematically erased disasters in Allied wartime history. Dr. Madhusri Mukherjee's exhaustive research, documented in her 2010 work, Churchill's Secret War, revealed through British cabinet papers that grain exports from India actually increased during the famine's peak months. The India Office records, declassified only in 1992, show that Churchill personally rejected multiple requests from the Viceroy of India, Lord Wavell, to redirect grain shipments back to Bengal. Food reserves that could have prevented the catastrophe were instead shipped to build stockpiles in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans for anticipated Allied operations. The scale of the tragedy was unprecedented. Government of India statistics, compiled by the Famine Inquiry Commission in 1945, documented 3 million deaths from starvation and disease between June 1943 and December 1944. Professor Amartya Sen's Nobel Prize-winning economic analysis demonstrated that Bengal actually had adequate food supplies at the time the famine was entirely artificial, created by export policies and hoarding driven by wartime speculation. The British government's own War Cabinet minutes, preserved in the National Archives, show full awareness of the developing crisis months before peak mortality began. Here's what makes this systematic erasure remarkable. Every major Allied victory narrative published between 1945 and 1990 excluded any mention of Bengal. Churchill's 6-volume memoir, The Second World War, published between 1948 and 1954, contains no reference to the famine, despite his direct involvement in the policy decisions that caused it. The official British war histories, compiled by the Cabinet Office Historical Section, similarly omitted any discussion of colonial famine policy. Even academic histories of the war, published in major universities, relegated Bengal to brief footnotes, if mentioned at all. The mainstream explanation for this omission centers on wartime necessity and limited information. Historians argue that wartime leaders faced impossible choices, that the strategic imperative of defeating fascism required difficult resource allocations. and that the full scale of the Bengal tragedy wasn't understood until decades later. The standard narrative suggests that Churchill and his cabinet operated with incomplete information, and that colonial administrators failed to communicate the severity of the crisis effectively. But the documentary evidence contradicts this explanation entirely. Cabinet papers show that detailed mortality reports reached London by August 1943. Churchill's personal correspondence, released under the 30-year rule, reveals his explicit awareness of the famine's scope and his conscious decision to maintain export policies. In one memo to the War Cabinet, he wrote that Indians were breeding like rabbits, and that famine was their own fault for not fighting hard enough against the Japanese. When Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, pressed for relief shipments, Churchill responded by asking why Gandhi hadn't died yet. These weren't decisions made in ignorance, they were calculated policies that prioritized white Allied populations over colonial subjects. The systematic exclusion from post-war narratives was equally deliberate. Internal Foreign Office memos from 1946 discussed the need to maintain colonial prestige and avoid feeding anti-imperial sentiment in the emerging Cold War context. Publishers' correspondence, preserved in various archives, shows editorial pressure to minimize colonial controversies in Allied victory accounts. The Bengal famine disappeared from official history through conscious editorial choice, not oversight. Some researchers suggest that Bengal represents a broader pattern of colonial violence embedded within the Allied war effort itself. Dr. Caroline Elkin's research on British counterinsurgency methods and Professor Mark Curtis's documentation of wartime resource extraction policies reveal systematic brutality that contradicts heroic liberation narratives. The silence around Bengal wasn't an anomaly. It was central to constructing a morally coherent version of Allied victory that could justify post-war Western dominance. How do 3 million deaths simply vanish from the historical record? What other wartime atrocities were deemed inconvenient to Allied mythology? If liberation was the goal, who decided which populations deserve to survive? Can a moral victory be built on foundations of systematic starvation? Yet even as Allied narratives erased colonial suffering, American policymakers were quietly studying European innovations in racial classification that would reshape their own legal frameworks. The Nuremberg race laws, American inspiration. You sit in a lecture hall at Harvard Law School, October 1934. The professor at the podium is tall, precise, speaking to a room of Germany's brightest legal minds. These aren't students. These are Nazi Party lawyers, jurists, legal architects of what will become the Reich citizenship law. They're taking notes. The professor explains American racial classification systems. One-drop rules, blood quantum laws, the legal frameworks that define who counts as white in America, who can marry whom, who can vote, who can own property. The Germans lean forward. They ask questions about enforcement, about precedent, about the constitutional mechanisms that make racial hierarchy legally bulletproof. This happened. Harvard hosted Nazi legal delegations throughout the 1930s. But when the Nuremberg trials began in 1945, this entire exchange vanished from the historical record. Dr. James Whitman, Ford Foundation professor of comparative and foreign law at Yale, documented this systematic erasure in his 2017 work, Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law. Whitman accessed previously sealed Nazi legal archives and discovered explicit citations of American racial statutes in the foundational documents of Nazi race law. The Blood Protection Law of 1935 directly references 15 American state miscegenation statutes. The Reich Citizenship Law's three-tier racial classification system was modeled on American Indian blood quantum regulations established by the Dawes Act of 1887. Heinrich Krieger, Nazi Germany's leading expert on American race law, published a comprehensive study titled Das Rassenrecht in den Vereinigten Staaten in 1936. The text runs to 412 pages. It catalogs American racial legislation state by state, providing German lawmakers with a detailed blueprint for legal apartheid. Krieger had spent 1933 and 1934 at the University of Arkansas, studying American race law firsthand under a fellowship program that brought Nazi legal scholars to American universities. Here's what makes this impossible to reconcile with a standard historical narrative. The Nuremberg prosecutors built their entire case on the unprecedented nature of Nazi racial crimes. Justice Robert Jackson, chief American prosecutor, argued in his opening statement that the Nazi legal system represented a complete break from civilized jurisprudence. But Jackson knew the American precedents. He had been Attorney General when the Justice Department maintained detailed correspondence with Nazi legal scholars between 1933 and 1939. The mainstream explanation is that American and Nazi racial systems were fundamentally different in scope and intent. American racial laws, however unjust, operated within constitutional frameworks and democratic institutions. Nazi racial laws led directly to genocide. The Nuremberg prosecutors correctly focused on the unprecedented scale and systematic nature of Nazi crimes without dwelling on legal precedents that might complicate American moral authority in the post-war order. But the archives tell a different story. Roland Freisler, who would later become president of the Nazi People's Court, attended that Harvard seminar in 1934. His personal notes, discovered in 1997 by historian Ingo Muller, contain detailed diagrams of American anti-miscegenation enforcement mechanisms. Freisler wrote that American racial law was shamefully primitive, not because it was morally wrong, but because it wasn't systematic enough. The Nazis saw American racial law as an incomplete blueprint that they could perfect through German organizational efficiency. Dr. Carol Romer, legal historian at Columbia University, analyzed the suppressed trial transcripts in her 2019 paper, Omitted Precedents: American Race Law in the Nuremberg Documentation Project. Romer found that American prosecutors systematically excluded evidence of American legal precedents from the documentary record. When Nazi defendants attempted to cite American racial statutes in their defense, these references were struck from the official transcripts. Hans Frank, Nazi Governor General of occupied Poland, explicitly referenced American Indian reservation law during his testimony. This entire exchange was classified and remained sealed until 2003. The deliberate erasure extended beyond the trials themselves. The American military government in Germany commissioned a comprehensive study of Nazi legal development in 1946. The initial draft, completed by University of Chicago legal scholars, included extensive documentation of American precedents. This section was removed before publication. The principal researcher, Professor Ernst Rabel, noted in his private correspondence that the American legal precedent sections were too sensitive for current political requirements. Some researchers suggest that this suppression was necessary for post-war American leadership in the emerging human rights framework. Others argue that it represents a fundamental distortion of historical understanding that prevented honest reckoning with American racial systems. The silence ensured that American racial law continued largely unchanged into the 1960s, insulated from the moral condemnation that befell its Nazi descendants. Why were Nazi legal scholars studying at American universities throughout the 1930s? What did American professors teach them about racial classification? How did this knowledge shape the legal architecture of the Holocaust? Why were these connections systematically erased from the historical record? What other precedents were too uncomfortable to acknowledge? But even more troubling alliances would emerge from the shadows of wartime diplomacy. Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact violations. You're standing in a diplomatic archive in Moscow, 1992. The Soviet Union has just collapsed. Filing cabinets that haven't been opened in decades are suddenly accessible to Western researchers. Your fingers trace across a manila folder marked August 1945, Manchurian Operations. Inside, you find cables between Stalin and Marshal Vasilevsky. The dates make your stomach drop. The invasion orders are dated August 6th. Hiroshima was bombed August 6th. The neutrality pact with Japan wasn't supposed to expire until April 1946. According to every diplomatic record you've studied, Stalin honored international law. But the documents in your hands tell a different story entirely. On August 9th, 1945, exactly 72 hours after the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, 1.5 million Soviet troops crossed into Japanese-held Manchuria. Operation August Storm, as Stalin called it, was the largest military operation in Soviet Far Eastern history. The Japanese Kwantung Army, numbering 700,000 men, was completely unprepared. Within 11 days, the entire Japanese position in mainland Asia had collapsed. 700,000 Japanese soldiers became Soviet prisoners. Most would never return home. This timing was no coincidence. Declassified records from the Soviet Defense Ministry, first accessed by historian David Glantz in 1995, reveal that Stalin had been planning the Manchurian invasion since February 1945. His communications with Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, documented in Vasilevsky's personal papers released in 1998, show detailed preparation beginning months before Hiroshima. The logistics alone required unprecedented coordination, moving 15,000 rail cars of equipment across the Trans-Siberian Railway, repositioning entire army groups from the European theater, establishing supply lines across 3,000 miles of Siberian wilderness. Here's what makes this impossible to reconcile with official diplomatic history. The Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, signed April 13, 1941, was still legally binding. Stalin had personally assured Japanese Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka that the Soviet Union would respect Japanese territorial sovereignty until the pact's expiration in April 1946. This wasn't a casual diplomatic nicety, it was international law, witnessed by German and Italian diplomats, recorded in the League of Nations archives. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Stalin was honoring his commitment to the Allies made at Yalta in February 1945, where he promised to enter the Pacific War within 3 months of Germany's surrender. Germany surrendered May 8th. Stalin attacked Japan exactly 3 months later. The Yalta Agreement superseded previous diplomatic arrangements, and the Soviet invasion was a legitimate response to Japanese aggression in China since 1937. But the timing reveals something the official Allied records omit entirely. Stalin didn't just break international law. He did it with surgical precision designed to maximize Soviet territorial gains while minimizing military casualties. The invasion began exactly when Japan was psychologically devastated by Hiroshima, but before surrender, negotiations could begin. Soviet intelligence, through their extensive spy network in Los Alamos, knew about the atomic bomb months in advance. Stalin knew Japan would surrender quickly once nuclear weapons were deployed. His window for territorial conquest was measured in days, not months. Documents from the Soviet Foreign Ministry, analyzed by historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa in his 2005 work, Racing the Enemy, show Stalin's calculations were explicitly territorial, not military. He needed to occupy as much Japanese-held territory as possible before Japan surrendered to the Americans. The Neutrality Pact violation wasn't a military necessity. It was imperial opportunism disguised as Allied cooperation. What's missing from the official record is any mention of this legal breach in Allied diplomatic communications. The combined Chiefs of Staff records, the Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence, the Potsdam Declaration negotiations, none acknowledged that Stalin's invasion constituted a violation of international law. The phrase neutrality pact violation appears nowhere in official Allied documentation from August 1945. Instead, Soviet participation is described as entering the Pacific War as agreed. American diplomatic cables from Ambassador Averell Harriman, released under the Freedom of Information Act in 1978, show Washington was privately concerned about Soviet territorial ambitions in Asia. Yet these concerns never translated into official protests about treaty violations. The 700,000 Japanese prisoners taken by Soviet forces became a footnote in surrender negotiations, not a diplomatic incident. Why was Stalin's breach of international law omitted from Allied diplomatic records? How does a violation witnessed by the entire international community disappear from official documentation? What other wartime agreements were quietly broken when the historical record was written? If international law meant nothing in August 1945, what did it mean for the soldiers who would soon be judged by those same legal standards? The silence surrounding Soviet treaty violations would prove especially significant when examining how other wartime orders, particularly those involving enemy combatants, were documented and prosecuted after the war ended. The Commissar Order implementation. You smell the cordite hanging in the summer air. Pine needles crunch beneath your boots as you approach the tree line outside Minsk. It's July 15th, 1941. Wehrmacht soldiers are separating prisoners into two groups: regular Red Army soldiers to the left, men in distinctive uniforms with red stars, and political insignia to the right. The separation is methodical, clinical. What happens next violates every convention of war ever written. The executions begin at dawn. Hitler's Commissar Order, issued on June 6, 1941, explicitly commanded the Wehrmacht to execute all captured Soviet political officers on sight. This wasn't an SS directive. This was a direct order to the regular German army. Military historian Omer Bartov documented in Hitler's Army, Soldiers, Nazis, and War in the Third Reich, published in 1991, that Wehrmacht units across the Eastern Front systematically murdered over 100,000 captured commissars between 1941 and 1944. German Sixth Army records, preserved in the Federal Archives in Freiburg, show detailed execution tallies reported up the chain of command like battlefield statistics. The documentation is overwhelming. Wehrmacht division commanders like General Walter von Reichenau actively promoted the policy. Army Group Center's daily reports, analyzed by historian Christian Streit in Keine Kameraden. Die Wehrmacht und die sowjetischen Kriegsgefangenen reference thousands of commissar executions carried out by regular infantry units. The 11th Army alone reported executing over 4,000 political officers in Ukraine by December 1941. These weren't isolated incidents or rogue units. This was systematic policy implemented by the German regular army across a front spanning nearly 2,000 miles. Here's what makes this disappearance impossible to explain. The Nuremberg trials barely mentioned Wehrmacht participation in commissar murders. The prosecution focused almost exclusively on SS atrocities. Justice Robert Jackson's opening statement, delivered November 21, 1945, referenced the Einsatzgruppen extensively, but mentioned the Commissar Order only in passing. The International Military Tribunal's final judgment, published in 1946, devoted 37 pages to SS crimes and fewer than 3 pages to Wehrmacht violations of the laws of war. The mainstream explanation is that post-war Allied prosecutors prioritized clear-cut cases against obvious war criminals. The SS had left extensive documentation of systematic murder. Wehrmacht crimes were more diffuse, harder to prosecute, and many potential witnesses were either dead or unreachable behind the Iron Curtain. The Western Allies needed West German cooperation in the emerging Cold War and avoided alienating former Wehrmacht officers who might prove useful against Soviet expansion. But the documentation was there all along. Wehrmacht field reports explicitly detailing commissar executions sat in Allied archives throughout the trials. Military historian Jeffrey Megargy's research, published in War of Vengeance, the German Army in World War II, in 2006, reveals that Allied intelligence officers had translated and cataloged these reports. By late 1945, they knew exactly what the regular army had done. British prosecutor Hartley Shawcross even drafted sections about Wehrmacht war crimes that were ultimately removed from the final indictments. The German military archives tell the story that didn't make it to Nuremberg. General Franz Halder's war diary, seized intact, contains dozens of references to commissar executions carried out by army units under his command. The Fourth Army's operational reports, studied by historian Hannes Heer, show systematic compliance with Hitler's order across hundreds of engagements. These weren't SS Einsatzgruppen operating behind the lines. These were Wehrmacht infantry companies, artillery battalions, and reconnaissance units executing captured Soviet officers as standard operating procedure. Some researchers suggest the omission was deliberate policy. Historian Fritz Stern argued in The Whitewashing of the Wehrmacht that American occupation authorities actively suppressed evidence of regular army participation in war crimes. Former Wehrmacht generals like Franz Halder and Heinz Guderian were quietly recruited as advisors for potential conflicts with the Soviet Union. Prosecuting them for commissar murders would have complicated these arrangements. The narrative of a clean Wehrmacht fighting an honorable war while SS units committed atrocities served everyone's post-war interests. The silence extends beyond the trials themselves. German military histories published in the 1950s and 60s rarely mention the Commissar Order. American official histories, like those in the United States Army and World War II series, focus on tactical operations while avoiding systematic Wehrmacht war crimes. The story that emerged portrayed the German regular army as professional soldiers, following orders, distinct from the ideological criminals in black uniforms. Why was Wehrmacht participation in systematic murder quietly erased from the official narrative? How many other Wehrmacht war crimes disappeared into classified archives? What other inconvenient truths about Allied cooperation with former Wehrmacht officers remain buried? Who decided that some war crimes were worth prosecuting and others were better forgotten? But the Wehrmacht's hidden crimes pale beside what Allied scientists were simultaneously doing to their own citizens in the name of victory. Manhattan Project radiation experiments. You feel the needle slide into your arm at the University of Rochester Hospital on December 30th, 1945. The doctor tells you it's a new treatment for your stomach condition. You trust him. The injection burns slightly as it enters your bloodstream. What you don't know is that you've just received 4.7 micrograms of plutonium-238. What you can't know is that this dose is calculated to remain detectable in your body for the rest of your life. What no one will tell you for 50 years is that you're not a patient anymore. You're a test subject in the most classified medical experiment in American history. The Manhattan Project's human radiation experiments began in 1943 under the direction of Dr. Joseph Gilbert Hamilton at the University of California, Berkeley, in partnership with Dr. Louis Hempelman at the University of Rochester. Between 1943 and 1947, researchers injected 18 patients with plutonium, 5 with polonium, and 3 with uranium at hospitals in Rochester, Chicago, San Francisco, and Oak Ridge. The Atomic Energy Commission, established in 1946, continued funding these studies through 1974. Dr. Stafford Warren, the Manhattan Project's chief medical officer, personally authorized injections containing between 0.17 and 4.7 micrograms of plutonium into hospital patients who had been told they were receiving experimental treatments for their medical conditions. The documented scope extends far beyond these direct injections. At Fernald State School in Massachusetts, researchers fed radioactive oatmeal to mentally disabled children, telling parents the boys were joining a science club. At the University of Washington, Dr. Carl Heller irradiated the testicles of 64 prisoners to study sterility effects. At Vanderbilt University, 800 pregnant women drank radioactive iron solutions, believing they were receiving prenatal vitamins. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, established by President Clinton in 1994, documented over 4,000 radiation experiments involving tens of thousands of subjects across the United States. Here's what makes this impossible to dismiss. These experiments continued for 4 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By August 9th, 1945, the world had seen plutonium's effects. The medical researchers knew exactly what radiation could do to human tissue. Dr. Robert Stone, the University of Chicago's chief medical officer for the Manhattan Project, wrote in his 1947 report that plutonium injections caused demonstrable injury to bone marrow and liver function. Yet the experiments expanded, the Atomic Energy Commission increased funding, new test sites opened. The mainstream explanation is that scientists needed to understand radiation exposure limits for Manhattan Project workers. They argue the doses were small, the patients were terminally ill anyway, and the research was crucial for establishing safety protocols in the nuclear age. The experiments, according to this view, served legitimate scientific purposes during an unprecedented moment in human history, when the effects of radioactive materials on living tissue remained largely unknown. But the medical records tell a different story. Eb Cade, the first plutonium injection victim at Oak Ridge in 1945, was a house painter with a broken leg from a car accident. He wasn't terminally ill. Neither was Elmer Allen, injected at the University of California in 1947 with the largest dose on record. The researchers selected subjects specifically because they had long life expectancies, ensuring the radioactive materials would remain in their bodies for extended observation periods. Dr. Hamilton's notes refer to patients as product and track them like laboratory specimens for decades. The classification level reveals the true nature of these studies. While Manhattan Project bomb research was declassified progressively through the 1950s and 60s, the human radiation experiments remained buried under restricted data designation until 1993. The Atomic Energy Commission ordered all records transferred to classified archives. Hospital staff were required to sign secrecy oaths. Patients' families were never informed. The cover-up apparatus was more extensive than the weapons program itself. Some researchers suggest these experiments served dual purposes: studying radiation effects for nuclear war preparedness while testing human subjects for biological warfare applications. The timing supports this theory. The experiments peaked between 1946 and 1950, precisely when Cold War biological weapons research accelerated. The same hospitals conducting plutonium injections were simultaneously running classified studies on infectious disease transmission and chemical weapons effects. The mathematical precision is unmistakable. Researchers calculated exact doses to produce measurable biological changes without immediate death. They tracked subjects for decades through Social Security records and medical databases. They correlated radiation exposure with cancer rates, organ damage, and genetic abnormalities in children born to exposed mothers. This wasn't medical research. This was human experimentation, designed to quantify the human cost of nuclear warfare. Why did experiments continue for years after the bombs proved their effectiveness? What biological data were they collecting that bomb damage assessments couldn't provide? How many other classified programs used American citizens as test subjects? Who authorized the transition from bomb development to human experimentation? What did they discover that required 50 years of secrecy? These questions point toward the deeper truth about how power operates when it believes itself beyond accountability. History, we're taught, is written by the victors, but these 10 moments reveal something far more unsettling. History is rewritten by those who inherit the victory. The official narrative of World War II isn't simply incomplete. It's been systematically curated, sanitized, and selectively edited to preserve not truth, but the moral legitimacy of the post-war order. From British deception operations that required erasing their own ingenuity, to American programs that demanded forgetting their recruitment of war criminals, each omission serves a purpose. The stories we don't tell protect the stories we do. What emerges from these hidden chapters isn't a simple tale of good versus evil, but something far more complex and morally ambiguous. The same Allied forces that liberated concentration camps also conducted radiation experiments on unknowing patients. The same Soviet Union that bore the brunt of Nazi aggression systematically murdered Polish officers in forest clearings. The same America that championed human rights, drew inspiration from German race laws, and recruited the architects of biological warfare. These aren't contradictions to be explained away. They're the actual substance of history, messier and more human than our textbooks allow. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation isn't what was hidden, but why it needed to be hidden at all. Each omission suggests that somewhere in government archives and classified files, decision makers understood that the full truth would undermine the very foundations of the world they were building. The silence surrounding these events isn't accidental, it's architectural. It holds up the structures of power, alliance, and moral authority that emerged from the war's aftermath. But silence is a living thing. It grows, it spreads, and eventually it begins to consume not just the uncomfortable truths we wanted to forget, but our ability to recognize truth at all. In trying to preserve a clean narrative, we may have lost something far more valuable: our capacity to confront the full complexity of human nature in its darkest hour. What else waits in the spaces between the words we're allowed to say?